Azure Integration Services explained, Logic Apps, Service Bus, API Management, and Event Grid. Hey, welcome. In this video, we're breaking down Azure Integration Services explained, Logic Apps, Service Bus, API Management, and Event Grid. Let's get into it. Let's talk about next up. What are Azure Integration Services? Azure Integration Services are a collection of fully managed Microsoft Azure tools designed to help enterprises connect disparate systems, orchestrate workflows, and exchange data in real-time or batch mode. Microsoft's Azure Integration Architecture documentation groups these tools around 4 primary services, though the broader platform also includes Azure Data Factory and Azure API Center. Azure Integration Services is Microsoft's cloud-native middleware. Traditional middleware like IBM MQ or MuleSoft typically requires on-premise infrastructure, licensing, and a dedicated operations team. Azure Integration Services architecture shifts that burden to managed PaaS, so your team focuses on designing integration flows rather than maintaining servers. The architecture follows a hub-and-spoke model. Azure Service Bus acts as the central message broker, Logic Apps trigger on events or schedules, API Management sits at the perimeter to control inbound and outbound API traffic, and Event Grid fans out event notifications to multiple subscribers simultaneously. These 4 Azure Integration Services components are designed to be used independently or in combination, depending on the complexity of your integration scenario. Next up, let's talk about the 4 core Azure Integration Services components. Here is a structured overview of all 4 Azure Integration Services components before going deeper into each. Logic Apps connects to 400+ connectors covering Salesforce, SAP, Dynamics 365, Outlook, and custom REST APIs. You can build multi-step approval flows, data transformation pipelines, and scheduled batch jobs without writing server-side code. The honest caveat, Logic Apps standard runs on Azure Functions infrastructure and requires more setup than the consumption tier, but it gives you network isolation and better performance for high-throughput scenarios. For teams already using Power Automate versus Logic Apps versus Azure Functions breaks down exactly which tool belongs in which scenario. Now, next up, how Logic Apps and Power Automate work together. Many organizations run both Logic Apps and Power Automate simultaneously, and that is by design. Power Platform governance principles apply to both. Business users build flows in Power Automate, IT teams build integration pipelines in Logic Apps, and both share connectors through the Microsoft Connector ecosystem. Getting this division right saves significant rework later. Power Automate consulting teams typically recommend Power Automate for human-in-the-loop workflows such as approvals, notifications, and data entry automation, and Logic Apps for system-to-system integration including ERP to CRM sync, file transformation pipelines, and EDI processing. The licensing model differs too. Power Automate charges per user or per flow. Logic Apps charges per execution. For high-volume batch processes, Logic Apps is usually cheaper. For ad hoc business automations that depend on user adoption, Power Automate is the better fit. These distinctions matter when you are budgeting a Power Platform development company engagement, because the wrong tool choice inflates long-term operating costs. Now, how to migrate on-premise to Azure using integration services. Migrating legacy integration middleware, typically IBM MQ, BizTalk Server, or on-premise MuleSoft, to Azure is one of the highest ROI cloud projects an IT team can pursue. A structured approach to migrate on-premise to Azure reduces risk significantly compared to an ad hoc migration. The 5 phases of Azure migration are: a lift and shift to Azure moves existing BizTalk orchestrations to Logic Apps with minimal redesign. This is faster and lower risk, but you carry over technical debt from the original design. Azure App Modernization goes further. It redesigns integration flows as event-driven microservices, adopts Service Bus instead of direct API calls, and deploys into a proper Azure landing zone implementation with hub-and-spoke networking. Next up, Azure Integration Services versus MuleSoft and AWS. Choosing between Azure Integration Services, MuleSoft, and AWS integration tools is a real architectural decision. The right answer depends on your existing technology stack, team skills, and long-term platform strategy. MuleSoft's Anypoint platform is stronger for complex data transformation and has a broader pre-built connector library for non-Microsoft systems. But for organizations already running Dynamics 365, Power Platform, and Azure AD, Azure Integration Services architecture fits naturally without additional licensing overhead. The total cost of ownership for MuleSoft at mid-market scale is typically 2 to 3 times higher than an equivalent Azure Integration Services implementation. AWS offers EventBridge, SQS, SNS, and Amazon MQ as rough equivalents to Microsoft's stack. AWS is often slightly cheaper for pure compute workloads, but Azure Integration Services wins on developer experience for .NET teams and native connectivity to Office 365, SharePoint, and Dynamics 365. According to Gartner's cloud infrastructure analysis, Azure holds the second largest cloud market share globally and has the deepest integration with Microsoft's enterprise software portfolio. For teams evaluating AI capabilities alongside integration, Azure AI Foundry versus AWS Bedrock covers that platform comparison in depth. Now, Azure cost optimization and managed services. Running integration pipelines in Azure without cost controls leads to surprise bills at month end. Azure Cost Optimization Consulting addresses 3 common problem areas: over-provision API management tiers, inefficient logic app polling triggers, and unthrottled service bus message retention policies. Specific tactics that reduce Azure integration costs. Our detailed breakdown of Azure Cost Optimization, 7 tactics beyond reserved instances, covers these and additional approaches for teams managing large Azure environments. Next up, why Q Services is your Azure migration partner. Q Services is a Microsoft certified solutions partner specializing in Azure, with delivery teams covering the full Microsoft stack, Azure Integration Services, Dynamics 365, Power Platform, and custom .NET applications. Choosing the right Azure migration partner at the start of a project is often the single biggest factor in whether the migration stays on budget and on schedule. Before any migration engagement, Q Services runs a structured Azure infrastructure assessment covering. The output is an actionable migration plan, not a 200-page report that sits on a shelf. Most clients complete the assessment in 2 weeks and have a signed migration roadmap within 4. Let's talk about next up, conclusion. Azure Integration Services give enterprise teams a production-grade toolkit for connecting systems, routing events, governing APIs, and orchestrating workflows without managing servers. Logic Apps handles process automation, Service Bus delivers reliable messaging, API management governs your API perimeter, and Event Grid powers real-time event-driven architectures. Used together, they replace fragile point-to-point integrations with a maintainable, observable, and scalable platform. Getting the Azure Integration Services architecture right from the start saves significant rework later. For teams planning a lift and shift to Azure or a full Azure app modernization project, Q Services can help. As a trusted Azure migration partner with 500+ completed Microsoft projects, we know what the pitfalls look like before you hit them. Book an Azure integration workshop today and walk away with a concrete plan tailored to your systems, your team, and your budget.